the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Learning How to Learn by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Attaining knowledge. Question: how can I attain knowledge of myself? I look at organizations and institutions, such as schools or universities or business enterprises or professions, and I can see that they have established reputations. They also have enrollment and recruitment, and they have objectives. For instance, if I become a politician, I am aiming for cabinet rank. If I want to study medicine, it is in order to become a practicing doctor or a research worker or a teacher. When I approach Sufi ideas, whether through books or individuals, I find that a similar kind of coherence is not there, or if it is, I cannot find it. I often become confused, and I have met many other people who are also confused, who are trying the same thing. Because of this, I also feel that an answer to this question would be of great value to many other people who believe that there must be truth and value in Sufi thought and activity, because it has continually produced great people, but that the way in and the curricula are baffling. Answer: it is interesting, not as a lesson in what Sufis are like or what the Sufi enterprise is about, to look at these words, for they display very clearly what people are like, and we will see in a moment how easily one can answer them by using materials, analogies, and ways of thought which they would have been able to use for themselves if they had really been as analytical and coherent as they imagine they are. First, it must be said that it is precisely because someone thinks like this that he is baffled. He has arbitrarily selected parallels and assumptions and seeks to apply them to us. Interestingly, he has misapplied them, with the result that he arrives at what he could even have subconsciously sought: confusion. One traditional way of answering this question would be to quote the proverb, "However fast you run, or however skillfully, you can't run away from your own feet." We will go through the analogies and show how they apply to us just as much as to anyone or anything else cited. First of all, it is not for us to satisfy each and every would-be student about Sufi applicability to himself and Sufic probity or otherwise. It is for him to satisfy himself, and he will probably use the same methods he uses when he applies to learn anything else. But he should remember that if he goes, for instance, to a school of medicine and asks, "How do I know that you can teach me?" he will be shown the door. He is not eligible. Such an approach is neither correct behavior nor indicative of a stage of intelligence in which one can be taught. There are plenty of people who do not adopt the attitude of an idiot, and it is the duty of the medical school to give its limited time to such people. It is someone else's task to do the more preliminary work with you. One function of the books already published is to provide this briefing. Secondly, the reputation of the Sufis is already well enough established and continues in that role from a base of repute which they have established even long before numerous contemporary institutions existed. Sufic continued flexibility, viability, and effectiveness, if you must measure in this way, are themselves evidences of their value in terms of the levels on which such things are assessed in the familiar world. The coexistence of genuine Sufic enterprises and imitation ones only parallels similar imitations of almost every other kind of institution in the world. It is no new thing, and it has virtually the same characteristics and origins. Thirdly, the idea of enrollment and recruitment naturally varies with the kind of institution. The enrollment and recruitment of, say, bank clerks differs from that of, say, soldiers. People may become bank clerks and find that they are not suited for banking life. They may become politicians and discover that they are suited to this life. They may enroll as deep-sea divers and discover that deep-sea diving is not what they thought it was, in spite of plenty of divers around, sufficient schools, and an abundance of literature on the subject. What are you seeking from Sufi studies or activity which differs from these things? Fourthly, of course, there is the question which comes under the heading of objectives. Suppose you want to be a politician. Nobody would say that you could become a cabinet minister before you were perhaps a legman for a minor parliamentary candidate, or an envelope licker in Party HQ, or even a canvasser for an obscure rural district council member. The objective, again, may be to be a cabinet minister or a prime minister. How many people at the beginning of their political careers, A, know what it is like to be a prime minister, even if they are aiming for it, and B, really will become a prime minister? In any case, the people who do attain such rank are the ones who obey the Chinese proverb, "The journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step." Fifthly, as to confusion, people frequently become confused either because they cannot understand the elementary steps they have to take, or because they invariably enjoy confusion, or for some other reason which they do not know. The origins of a state of confusion can often be discovered merely by transposing the problem into terms whose structure is more familiar, as I have just done. Among the Sufis, as among those of other paths, it has always been required that the intending participant practice certain requirements to fit him or her for higher learning. In modern societies, equivalent and often exactly similar prerequisites are found. Because so many familiar institutions with clearly laid out requirements already exist in contemporary cultures, it should be easier, not more difficult, for people to understand, given real desire, the requirements. These include humility, dedication, abstinence, restraint, obedience. Unless you exercise these virtues, you will get nowhere in banking, the army, medicine, politics, human service, or anywhere else in many forms of mundane endeavor. If, on the other hand, you want to escape these tiresome preliminaries and flee into Sufism, then we know what you are like, and we cannot talk to you at all. To say yes to the Sufi way is to say no to imagined escapes. It is no accident that Sufis find that they can connect most constructively with people who are well integrated into the world, as well as having higher aims, and that those who adopt a sensible attitude towards society and life as generally known can usually absorb Sufi teachings very well indeed. You started your question with the matter of the visibility of study institutions, but the world itself, as well as special attitudes, properly understood, constitute the Sufi school. Remember the words of Maghribi, who said to a monkish individual, "What you are seeking in your retreat, I see clearly in every road and alleyway." It is no use adding external things, say observances, to the life of someone who is carrying on too many unproductive observances. It is hopeless to add ideas to minds already too full of ideas. Study institutions may become visible when the head is more emptied of imaginings. Sa'di and the Man with a Full Head. Sa'di has a tale about a man whose head was full of imagined knowledge and arrogance as a result, who went to visit Koshia from a great distance. Koshia taught him nothing, saying, "You may think yourself wise, but nothing can be put into a full pot." If you are full of pretense, Sa'di continues, you are in fact empty. Become empty of fruitless ideas, he teaches, so that you may come and fill with higher perceptions and understand real meaning. There is a widespread notion in non-traditional societies such as the current Western one that their scientific base causes people to think, for some reason, in a way different from that of ancient or Eastern peoples. Anthropologists, interestingly enough, have pointed out that human thinking habits are everywhere very similar, and that the models and assumptions used by, say, the Africans of old and the Europeans and Americans are not at all different. The fact that this expert information has not filtered down to general knowledge is in itself an indication of the contention of, for example, R. Horton, who commented on the unexamined assumptions of Western and African people thus: "The Western layman's ground for accepting the models propounded by the scientist is often no different from the young African villager's ground for accepting the models propounded by one of his elders. In both cases, the propounders are deferred to as the accredited agents of tradition. As for the rules which guide scientists themselves in the acceptance or rejection of models, these seldom become part of the intellectual equipment of members of the wider population. For all the apparent up-to-dateness of the content of his worldview, the modern Western layman is rarely more open or scientific in his outlook than is the traditional African villager." Knowledge of yourself may involve, if we are learning at the present time, a knowledge of the way of thinking of your society, and to realize that you are probably its product, and that this knowledge can be attained in fact by such anthropological and psychological observations made by the Sufis in the course of their teaching how to assume new and more promising extra perspectives. This involves knowing more through knowing oneself through knowing how one thinks about others, and seeing yourself with other eyes than your own, all ways of applying the lessons which, so far in the West, are mainly only being pointed out, and are not linked with attempts to further one's perceptions of what lies beyond familiar consciousness. The statement, "He who knows himself knows his Lord," means, among other things, that self-deception prevents knowledge. The question asks about how to attain knowledge of oneself. The first self, about which to attain knowledge, is the secondary, essentially false self which stands in the way, however useful it may be for many daily transactions. It must be set aside, made something which can be used or not used, not something which uses you. The way in which this is done is by self-observation, registering how and when this self is operating, and how it deceives. A man once remarked, in the hearing of the Sufi ancient Junaid of Baghdad, that at the time it had become difficult to find brothers. How to find your brothers. Junaid instantly identified the one-sidedness of this attitude. If you seek a brother to share your burden, brothers are in truth hard to find. But if you are in search of someone whose own burden you will yourself share, there is no scarcity of such brothers, he said. Ansari on looking at yourself. You want to be able to evaluate institutions of the Sufis. You want to gain knowledge of yourself. You can do the former when you have done the latter. Sheikh Abdullah Ansari of Herat, in common with all classical Sufi teachers, insists that you must see yourself other than with your own eye. That is to say, apart from your present way of looking at things, or your fixation with this secondary self will only increase in strength and blot out objective understanding. Analogy of the gardener. Until you can see yourself clearly and constantly for what you are really like, you have to rely upon the assessment of a teacher, the gardener of Rumi's comparison. A gardener going into an orchard looks at the trees. He knows that this one is a date, that one a fig, the other a pomegranate, a pear, or an apple. To do this, he does not have to see the fruit, only the trees. Difficulties. Question: what are the difficulties in the way of transmitting knowledge today in the West? Answer: very little different in essence, though different in appearance, from the difficulties at all times. To understand this, you have to obtain some perspective. If in the Middle Ages in Western Europe you had preached, say, hygiene, what would have happened to you? You would have been seen as heretical for a start, because only infidels washed. You would have been castigated by reputable people for assuming that you were better than they were, because you washed and they didn't. If you taught about microbes, would you have got away with it? If you used their mass media, you would have been accused of immodesty and worse. If you tried to set up your own, you would be accused of sinister intentions, or worse. And, equally important, who would listen to you? The freaks, the occultists, the failures who were out to find a shortcut to success? Not the people who were to become the authorities on hygiene. Much preliminary groundwork would have to be done, explaining assumptions, proving that bias was not reality, living down unwarranted mudslinging. Rise above your own barrier. The great Sufi poet Hafiz says, and how rightly, that the difficulties are within people, for they imagine things which are really irrelevant to be important in this search. You yourself are your own barrier. Rise from within it. The priest and the public. People mistake information for knowledge and one indication for another. This is mainly because they generally do not know what they want, and often think that they want something when they do not. This difficulty besets all kinds of activities in the West. I've recently been talking to the priest in charge of a church in a new town development. He had carried out a careful poll of what his new parishioners wanted, what kinds of sermons, how they are to be delivered, what subjects they were interested in. This all took him several months. In the end, he had a picture of what was required, and he provided the themes, treatment, and atmosphere which the people had asked for. The people came to his church services for the first few weeks, and then came in smaller and smaller numbers. The only reason which they gave when questioned about their lack of interest is, "It isn't what we thought it would be like." This shows, as you will find in innumerable Sufi stories, that neither the teacher nor the learner knows, without a real situation, how the teaching is to be carried on, if it is not done merely by indoctrination or emotional arousal in specific instances. The fact that teachers in many disciplines think that they know how to teach, and classes think that they know how to learn, obscures the fact that people in general accept this folkloric belief without testing. The only exception to both parties carrying on for centuries with diminishing returns is in areas, such as commerce, where nobody can afford to imagine things. Tests have to be made. The demand for laughter. There is an instructive example in British television where many people complained about the production habit of putting a laughter soundtrack onto shows, following every joke, or having a studio audience. Viewing audiences did not like it. The head of light entertainment at London Weekend Television in 1970 bowed to the bitter criticism and flood of letters by removing the laughing audience. The actors now complained that they could not act properly without laughter to help their timing. So, continued Mr. Barry Took, I brought the audiences back and everything was fine again. Almost exactly the same people who had written in to complain wrote again to say how much they preferred the shows with audiences. How to sell books to scholars. When circularizing scholars with lists of new books, we found a similar result. Postal advertisements couched in impeccable scholastic language brought hardly any sales. But circulars which were written like advertisements for soap powder had large numbers of these respectable gentlemen sending in their orders by return, even though the books were on serious subjects. When I mentioned this result in a newspaper interview, several academics wrote to me agreeing that they preferred an exciting advertisement and that scholarly treatments bored them. The Dead Who Walk. Whether in the East or in the West, one of the difficulties in the way of transmitting Sufi knowledge has not changed in many centuries. As the Sufi ancient Abul Hasan Kirkani stated, "Many people who are in reality dead are walking in the streets. Many who are in their graves are in reality alive," he tells us in Attar's Lives of the Masters. The difficulties of transmitting knowledge about which you ask mean that only a small number of people can immediately learn what is being taught. The others have to go through exposure to experience and teaching until their inward perceptions are able to connect with the transmission. Many people believe that their interest in a subject is preparation enough. Further, they cannot credit that others may have the perceptive capacity while they themselves must wait. Junaid and the jealous students. Junaid illustrated this on the overt level one day when some of his 20 students were jealous of his attachment to one of their number. The parable in action which he devised is worth thinking about. He called all the disciples and ordered them to bring 20 fowls. Each pupil was instructed to take one bird to a place where he could not be seen and to kill it. When they all returned, the birds were dead, all except the one taken by the controversial student. Junaid asked him in the presence of the others why he had not killed his bird. "Because you told me to go to a place where I could not be seen, and there is no such place. God sees all," answered the man. The difficulty of transmission of knowledge is bound up with the orientation of the student. Wanting knowledge is not enough. As we see in the case of Junaid's students, only 1 in 20 acted in accordance with his own beliefs. Teachership according to Mu'inuddin Chishti. The institution of teachership is there for this reason, that the learner must learn how to learn. Understanding this, one realizes why it is not an extreme statement to say, as did Mu'inuddin Chishti, it should be taken to heart that whatever the spiritual guide persuades his disciples to do and to practice, it is for the benefit of the spiritual disciple himself. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.